Hello, and welcome to this new edition of ZEW live from Mannheim. Today, this is a joint event from the ZEW, the Center for European Economic Research, and the US Consulate in Frankfurt. I'm Jessica Stornberg, a business journalist in the ARD. I have the pleasure to talk to two excellent experts today on the economic consequences of the Russian war in the Ukraine and the views from the United States. Not so much pleasure is the topic today that we discuss in the next hour. The invasion of Russia in the Ukraine has already cost so many lives. It has created a humanitarian crisis, millions of refugees. It has destroyed families, homes, shattered infrastructure, and we have turmoil in the markets. We want now here focus on the geopolitical challenges facing the European as well as the global economy. From Frankfurt, connected to us here is the US Consul General Norman Thatcher Sharp. Hello and welcome, Mr. Sharp.
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yeah, the pleasure is with us. And next to me, ZEW President Achim Wambach. Hello and welcome.
Hello, and hello to Frankfurt.
And we are happy to have you with us on the screens. And feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will take them up in the second half of our discussion. And we are glad to have the possibility that you participate. I would also like to mention, thanks to the ZEW Sponsors Association for Science and Practice for supporting this event. What we want to focus in this edition on consequences of the war are three main aspects. First, the energy supply as a very important issue, of course. Second, the direct and indirect impact of the war on the economy. And third, do we have a Cold War situation reloaded? Keyword or catchword, price of security and the illusion of change through trade, question mark. We had the 9th of May yesterday, a meaningful day in Russia celebrating the end of World War II, the victory over Germany. And the world was very closely listening to what Vladimir Putin would say on the occasion of the military parade and the ceremony. Mr. Sharp, American diplomats returned to the US Embassy in Kiev exactly yesterday. What message is coming with that?
It's a very important message of solidarity with Ukraine. Our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, had announced previously that we wanted to get our diplomats back in there as soon as possible. So it's both I would say, a symbolic thing to have our diplomats there yesterday, but it's also a very substantive thing. We need to have our diplomats on the ground there to be able to conduct face-to-face talks with our Ukrainian government partners, with civil society there, with the Ukrainian public. And so we were very happy that we were able to get people back in there. We have not officially reopened the embassy yet, the embassy building, but we're working on doing that as quickly as possible.
Wambach, looking to what has happened so far within the last 2.5 months, how worried are you about the future?
I would say about the immediate future, I'm very worried. So we have a war in Europe. People are dying. No one can predict how long this war will go. Will be extended beyond the borders of the Ukraine, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in it. But I guess you asked the question because I'm an economist, and even as an economist, I would say for the immediate future, I'm worried. So we see prices are increasing, energy prices are rising. They will further rise if it comes to the oil embargo, if it comes to the gas embargo. There is a chance that we get to a recession. So we have price increase and recession. That would be a stagflation. So for the immediate future, there is reason to worry.
You just mentioned the oil embargo. That is just on the topic of the EU. It is the most important economic issue that is coming with that war. This European energy dependency on Russia. Mr. Sharp, the EU is preparing for an embargo on Russian oil with the 6th sanction package. Especially Hungary is slowing down the process, talking about a veto. but also other member states, because dependency is still too high. There are pipelines that could not be further used, and we are talking about landlocked countries. How important is it to get them into the embargo?
Well, as you know, the U.S. Has already announced our ban of the import of Russian oil, gas, and coal. And in fact, we saw the entire G7 community commit to phasing out the import of Russian oil. So I think we're moving in the right direction on this. We've said all along that we recognize fully that our European partners are in different positions than we are with regard to dependency on Russian oil. We're doing all that we can to support them. President Biden has announced the release of oil from the U.S. Strategic Reserve in order to help with the supply on the market. And we've committed to providing more gas for the Europeans. So we're in constant discussion with our European partners. And if anything, with this looking at sort of the bigger picture, what this is going to do is accelerate the movement of Western economies away from dependence on not only Russian oil and gas, I think, but in the longer term, it's going to accelerate the transition to a newer green economy, because we were already seeing that the economies are recognizing that we need to move quickly away from fossil fuels to the new green economy. So I think that's going to be accelerated through Mr. Putin's actions. So once again, he's going to achieve the opposite of what he was hoping to achieve with this action.
So you mentioned the strategic reserves, especially on oil, but also on gas in the market. And of course, this is a process that the price is not increasing too high, and Putin is maybe getting more money by selling less. But how long can they go?
Well, how long the war goes depends on Mr. Putin. He has to make a choice to stop his aggression. How high, where we go on the energy front. Again, I think that yes, we're seeing in the short term that this is resulting in severe pressures on the market. We see those in the United States as well as in Europe. But I think in the end, that's going to accelerate this transition away from fossil fuels. We've been talking for. I've been serving in Europe for 25 years, and for at least the last 10 years, we've been talking to our European partners about the importance of diversifying away from dependency on Russian oil and gas. And we're seeing exactly what we have feared for a long time coming to happen now, that Mr. Putin is using his energy reserves as a weapon. And so again, there's going to be this short-term turmoil, disruption, and pain that reminds us that democracy is not free, that there is a cost associated with it. But I think in the end, what we're going to see is that we move away from this dependency on Russian oil and gas, and from oil and gas in general, towards a newer green economy. And when I want to also mention the sanctions. It's not just about banning oil or banning gas, but it's about the technology that Mr. Putin needs to be able to unlock those resources that his economy depends on. So his economic model is based on extraction of these resources. But to do that extraction, he depends on high tech from the West, and we are banning the export of that. So in the longer run, this is sort of a accelerating trend that will make it even harder for him in the future to be able to extract oil and gas, and is going to really damage his economy, and again promote this acceleration away from not just Russian oil and gas, but oil and gas in general.
Mr. Wambach, I think what we can say is time is decisive. And what is your evaluation? The dependency is mutual. Europe needs Russian oil still, and especially gas. But on the other hand, how strongly does Russia need the money?
Yeah, so in the beginning, there was some arguments that Russia is not so dependent. It has its stock of, not so dependent on the money because it has its finances and they are paying in rubles. But what we see is that it's working. So we see inflation is up in the night in Russia. We see that unemployment is increasing. So the sanctions are working. With oil, I agree. Time is of importance. Oil. To first approximation is world market. So this world market for oil, you can transport it. Yeah. However, some oil is not so easily replaceable. So in Germany, we will have problems in Eastern Germany because that depends on Russian oil to some degree. So 10% of our oil, we are independent, but that would be manageable. Hungary is much more of an issue for Hungary because they need Russian oil and they can replace it so far. And it also works the other way around. So for Russia, they could sell it in principle on the world market, yeah, but not so easily. And we see that there is a price, the margin, a lower price for Russian oil on the world market. So they suffer. They suffer from that companies are not transporting Russian oil anymore. So it works and it has influence on Russia.
But the longer it takes to abandon from Russian gas and oil, the more time Russia has to build up new business relations, and the longer can European money be used to finance the war. How do you see that trade-off? We can't hear you right now.
I would just point out that it's not so easy for Mr. Putin to shift where he's selling his oil and gas. I mean, sending oil to China, for example, requires pipelines that don't exist that are going to take years to build. So it's not as easy as quickly and nimbly his switching his markets. But again, if we can increase the costs to him for continuing this aggression, our hope is that he will not be able to. We will exhaust his ability to keep funding this and force him to recognize that this policy of aggression is misguided. So our strategy is not based just on the sanctions and the financial penalties, but also on the longer-term strategy of supporting Ukraine so that it can push back while we're squeezing Mr. Putin financially. And we hope that these various lines of effort will be able to converge and force Mr. Putin to recognize that he's going down the wrong path here.
But what do you think? How quick has this embargo to come? Hungary is now saying they might veto.
So we saw that Ms. von der Leyen was in Budapest yesterday, and she said afterwards that there was good basis for continuing the discussions further. So I think that the European Union is moving in the right direction. There's a lot of details that have to be worked out because of the dependencies, the relative dependencies of each economy that makes up the union on Russian oil. So I think we will see continued progress in this, and we're hopeful that pretty soon the Europeans will be able to move forward in a unified way.
Mr. Wambach, do you want to add something?
You see, we have the issue with gas in Germany. So Hungary has problems with an oil embargo, yeah, and for good reasons. And then Germany has problems with a gas embargo for good reasons, yeah. And it's a cost analysis. So how dependent are we we are on gas, much more dependent than on oil, yeah. And how, what is the price we are willing to pay for a gas embargo and for an oil embargo? I think the oil embargo would be much more effective, because it's a much larger part of Putin's income, yeah. But still, we have to overcome the issue that Hungary depends strongly on oil, so we have to find solutions for that.
But you mentioned gas. We are now talking about a situation where the EU decides the end of supply. What if Russia would decide on the end of a supply? If we would have a sudden cut or a sudden suspension of gas delivery, how huge would be the economic impact?
Actually, my guess would be that the first thing we see is that Russia is creating even more uncertainty, which would lead in even further price increases. And, because everyone is nervous about the embargo, and that will run into, into Putin's coffin, Putin's box here, because, larger prices is a good news for him, So with the first steps we will see are going that direction, But at some point we might get an embargo, even from the Russian side, and we have to prepare for it, And my feeling is that we are not well prepared at the moment, So we have some formal rules. What will happen if there's a gas embargo? So then the Bundesnetzagentur, so our regulator, is in charge to distribute the gas, But what are the rules for distributing it? Who will get the gas? And what is the international? Do we do it just for Germany? How do we interact with other states? Because we are not the only one depends on Russian gas. That's not yet sorted out. So I think we have to spend much more effort in preparing for the situation if we want to do it or if we will get it. But in any case, we have to be prepared.
But we have that rule of rationing according to the emergency plan that is based on a EU directive. Consumer would have the highest priority if there would be a need for rationing. From an economic perspective, how should energy be distributed when it comes scarce?
So you would say according to willingness to pay, because the willingness to pay gives an indication who needs it most, and it takes a view of the companies. Some can replace their product, some can substitute it, some can, buy input from some company being abroad and not produce it here. So, but we don't know it, and actually the Bundesnetzagentur, the regulator, doesn't know it so well, and so there it makes sense to have some kind of mechanism which really, like an auction mechanism, who pays the most. For the households, it's much harder because, they can buy it on an auction market, but even there we need incentives for them to save on gas consumption, And for example, one case could be that you say, okay, you're guaranteed 80% of previous consumption from the previous years, but if you save more, you can sell it to the market, you can give it to the market. So they have a strong also financial incentive to save, and that would then put away the pressure from the companies to make also saving reactions. But that has to be prepared today, because it's not so simple to change the contracts. You have to measure how much gas they are consuming, you have to motivate them, you have to find ways to pay them, and so that all has to be prepared at the moment and not in 6 months.
Now, right?
Yes.
Now. But do you see any signs that all the stakeholders are just preparing for that?
They are, I would say it like that one. The Bundesnetzagentur, who knows she is in charge for the companies, they are nervous. So the head of Bundesnetzagentur wrote newspaper articles that it's hard, to dispute, and he also thinks about auction mechanisms. I see on that side, we're going in the right direction. On the household side, I don't see it yet. I don't see that because we have 40 million people being dependent on Russian gas for heating, and these are many small contracts and these are social issues involved. So that's really a big task, And I know they're talking about it, but I don't see the steps yet to prepare the households for a gas embargo.
And this dependency, Mr. Sharp, how do you see this? How do you see this dependency, Mr. Sharp, that it's especially so many German households are depending on Russian gas? That it has been, but you mentioned it earlier. You have been talking to the German government for 10 or more years to get rid of this dependency, especially on Russian gas. So how do you see it now?
Well, I think that now that we're seeing Mr. Putin weaponize his energy, finally we are seeing action here, and I agree that all the various stakeholders involved in this are really very, very strongly engaged in trying to figure out a solution, whether at the national level in Berlin, but when I talk also to regional governments here, when I talk to chambers of commerce, this is the hot topic that everybody's engaged in figuring out how to diversify away from their dependencies, how to find substitutions, how to move more quickly to different sources of energy, how to expand the use of alternative renewable sources of energy like wind and solar. So something like this doesn't happen overnight. We recognize that, but I think we are moving in the right direction. And let's not lose sight of the bigger picture at the same time. The sanctions were a response to Mr. Putin's aggression. since we put these these sanctions and these financial penalties in place, the estimates of Russia's GDP growth this year are double-digit negative. So the sanctions are having a very real effect that is going to affect Mr. Putin's ability to be able to continue to wage this war. So there's very much the short term figuring out how to quickly accelerate our Germany's movement away from this dependence and how to diversify. And then there's a longer term question of moving away completely from what this dependency on oil and gas. And the whether you're talking at the federal level or regional government levels or household levels, we see really an accelerating movement away from fossil and carbon-based fuels. I was at the Planck Institute last week down in Tübingen, and at the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy the week before that. And they are these kind of institutions that bring various stakeholders together are really engaged on this question of the movement away to a future that is not carbon-based. And I think we're going to see an acceleration of that.
We have already many questions in the chat. To mention that, we will take them up a bit later on, little by little. But to get on that point further, especially when you mention the renewables, how well are we prepared to get these renewables in place now? Because even if there are people that are just now thinking, oh, this is a very good moment right now to put solar panels on the roof of my house, for example, then you have problems with delivery, you have problems to find craftsmen. So how well we are prepared to now make this switch so quickly, so much faster than we have been on track before?
Selected with a plan to go more quickly in renewables, yeah, and they that's the agenda they have in any case, and now they want to go even faster, which will be hard, to go faster and go even faster. They want to go as fast as possible. However, what you say is that the public opinion has changed to some degree, that they all see the necessity to go in that direction. And what was blocking renewables was, like we need electricity network, we need more wind power. Yeah, that was the population, that was us. Yeah, they were, blocking it, and they will still do it in some region. But there will be less public movement against these developments. So I think that's kind of the good thing about it, that we have a strong public opinion in favor of going into the renewables. But let me also say that's not the solution to the gas problem and the oil problem in the short run. Yeah, we are talking about 10 years, 15 years. Yeah, so it's good that we get this push, but we have to live for the next 10 to 15 years, or actually for the next 20 years, I suppose, with gas and oil, and we have to find other ways to diversify, like having an LNG terminal, so a terminal for liquid gas, and diversify our supplier base. It's not just Russia. We need more suppliers for gas, and the same is with oil.
And we have to make decisions right now. How this objective can be, on the one hand, this diversification of energy supply, and on the other hand, solving the short-run problem, rely longer on fossil resources, nuclear power, or put a lot more pressure on renewables. There's coming with it decisions that has to be made right now.
No, that's right, and they are taken. So they want to build the LNG terminal.
It's going into the right direction.
Yeah, it's. So they still don't want to have nuclear energy. So you could argue about that one. The world is having nuclear energy and we don't have it. Yeah, but we see extension of coal. Yeah, we see LNG terminals. Yeah, the gas will become more expensive even after the war. Yeah, because we diversify, and diversification in that case means it will become more expensive. Yeah, and that makes coal relatively more attractive. So coal will stay for longer, I suppose, than it's initially planned. Yeah, but these, I think that's moving in the right direction. Yeah.
Mr. Scharf, will the U.S. increase its own exploitation of fossil fuels, given the high demand worldwide right now?
We're certainly trying to find ways to help help Europe out during this pinch point era. And as I said, we've committed to helping to export to Europe over the next year. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but I want to say 15. Is it billion? I don't remember the exact, but we committed to a large increase in the amount of gas that we make available for our European partners over the coming year because of recognizing what's going on. I just wanted to add, I've been here for about 9 months in Germany, and as I've gone around and asked people about this, whether students at schools, government partners, or businesses and their representative organizations, kind of everybody comes back to two main factors that have been the principal barriers to expanding more quickly the use of renewables and moving away from dependence on Russian oil and gas. And the first one is what we call in the United States NIMBY, not in my backyard. Everybody's in favor of more windmills or more solar. They just don't want it where they live or on their house or in their neighborhood where they can see something. And then the second is the bureaucracy. A lot of government people themselves, and certainly the business community, have said to be able to put in place something like a new LNG terminal, the bureaucracy is so daunting that it has really thwarted these kind of attempts in the past. And I think that what we're seeing now is a change in both of those, where, as you pointed out, the public opinion has moved drastically towards we're willing to pay more, we're willing to make sacrifices in order to have more alternative energy and to reduce our dependence on Russian oil and gas. And we've seen very clearly the government resolve to get things done, like to get 4 liquid natural gas terminals built quickly and on an accelerated basis, and breaking down these bureaucratic obstacles that have lain in the path of success in the past. So that's a great thing to see, that both the public opinion and the governmental efforts are converging together. And so I'm maybe slightly more bullish on the timeline than you laid out just now. I think that we're going to see an acceleration away more quickly than that 10 to 15 years you laid out.
There's a question in the chat that fits to that, what we are just right now in the discussion. It is in regard to both you and Mr. Wambach and Mr. Scharpf, the role of free trade agreements, for example, CETA, to become more independent. Is that a solution?
Well, that would actually, I think that's one of the conclusion out of this the horrible situation, that we have to diversify more. So we have to get rid of our dependency, and we see where our partners are much more clearly here. So the partners are the United States and the Western world. And so I think one clear conclusion is that we need to get more trade agreements so that companies are enabled to diversify. Yeah, and that CETA is a good example. So it's not clear why CETA hasn't yet been fully approved in Europe. Yeah, and that's a trade agreement with Canada. So, whom else do you wish as a trade partner, if not Canada? Yeah, so, but also, one could think about, a trade agreement with the United States, with South America, we have with India, these are all trade agreements which are being debated at some point or in the progress. But I would say, one of the results here should be that we have to diversify more, we have to get rid of the dependency, and we have to see more clearly, which are the countries where we, trust that the relationship is stable over a longer time. Yeah, and so I'm fully in favor of getting actually even more trade agreements than we are discussing at the moment.
Mr. Scharpf, would you be also in favor of pushing forward a free trade agreement?
I have to laugh a little bit because, again, I've worked in Europe as a U.S. diplomat for the last 25 years or more, and I remember very clearly the battle that we were doing, and it really was a battle back during the second half of the Obama administration. We were trying to get TTIP passed. I was serving in Slovakia. a country that is hugely export dependent. And yet to get public and business sentiment in favor of something like that was really difficult. We saw the same thing in Germany. We saw it in Austria. And so all of a sudden now everybody's in favor of TTIP. Oh, why can't we do TTIP? And what I want to say to people is, where the heck were you 8 years ago when we had a real opportunity to get this done and we were really trying hard? And we didn't have the support then. And it was, in my view, and not to linger on the past, but it was really thinly veiled protectionism. And so here we are today. I'm firmly convinced that our two economies, Europe and the United States, have to work together to set the standards for business and technology for the 21st century. That with our combined economic power, we are better able to address the real challenge, I think, the two real challenges of the 21st century, which are fighting climate change and China's authoritarian efforts to remake this rules-based international democratic order that we created after World War II, and that has given us peace, security, and prosperity for so long. So we need each other's economies. We need to work together. We are both leaders in technology, and we share democratic values that make us natural partners. But I don't think that we're quite ready for a comprehensive trade agreement on the scale of TTIP at this point. However, there's a lot of other ways that we can collaborate on setting standards. We have this new US-EU Trade and Technology Council that sets standards for business and tries to bring in various sectors harmonization together. So I think there's a lot we can do short of a comprehensive agreement. I think that a lot of the people who are serving in the current Biden administration were also serving during the Obama administration, and they remember the difficulties that we had in negotiating TTIP with our European partners. So I think there's a little bit perhaps of shyness away from doing something so big and comprehensive as a TTIP, but there's so many other opportunities where we can collaborate on the importance, the really super important future focused thing of setting standards. We saw recently that in Frankfurt, the new International Sustainability Standards Board is going to be based here. And it's a classic example of a US and European and Canadian democratic free-based partners working together to set standards around the financing of anti-climate change efforts. So that's just one example of many where we can work together on this.
Mr. Wambach, so many years later now, do you see TTIP, or do we all see TTIP now in another light because of all the development that has been since?
Oh, I hope so. I think you're perfectly right to say that was protectionist, going against TTIP. And they have their social arguments, environmental arguments, but in the end it boils down to protectionist. But we always focus in the trade agreements. We focus on the tariffs, and so we were all nervous when Trump raised the tariffs against Europe. What does it mean? But the point you're making is, I think it's a very good one. That setting standards, technology cooperation is to some degree much more important. Tariffs are, they increase a little bit or decrease a little bit, and you see it in the figures. Yeah, that's right. But standard setting, I think that's also, that's I think the strengths we have in the Western world, because at the moment it can be over standards. Yeah. So there's China is very active in this market. Yeah. We have a research group here at the ZEW also dealing with standards and how they diverge into the industry. Yeah, once it's set, and then it's there. Yeah, and you can't get around it. And some companies have patent on these standards. Yeah, and so that's a really important issue. And I think it's very good to see these developments, that we are working closer in that regard.
I would like to pick up a question from the chat because it fits here right now as well. One spectator wonders what the war means for China. Mr. Sharp, you just mentioned the role of China.
So I think that what Mr. Putin has done in Ukraine has thrust into the limelight for everybody to see the importance of the democratic values question. And I think, as I said before, one of the two defining challenges of the 21st century will be this effort by China that we're already seeing, as you just said, to set standards, to remake international organizations, to really make the world, this rules-based international order that we created after World War II, to remake it in a more statist, authoritarian way that is less reflects the importance of human rights and democratic values. So I think that in a way, Mr. Putin is doing our work for us. He has unified the West. And when I say the West, I don't mean just the US and Europe, but also other partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others around the idea of the importance of democratic values. What I say to companies when I go visit them is, when you do a transaction, you're not just dealing with it's not just a business decision, it is really a values-based decision. And we really need to start taking into account what we do, these values. This Trade and Technology Council that I talked about, the US and EU, will be meeting again actually next week in Washington. I can't remember if it's in Washington or Brussels, but they're going to be engaged exactly around this. And I totally agree with you. This so important because of its long range, far-reaching implications. This question of setting standards together, and that's what we really need to do. We need the West to set these democratic standards. China is we don't want to. We have no desire to fence them off from the world economy. They are an indispensable part of the world economy. But we want to make sure that we have standards that enable our businesses to compete fairly with them. We want to make sure that they're not engaged in unfair trading practices. We will call them out when they violate human rights, when they imprison people in concentration camps, in the Uyghurs in Western China. So, but at the same time, after the COP climate summit in Glasgow last fall, we issued a joint statement with China, the United States and China, about the importance of fighting climate change and about our shared commitments to that. So on the big challenge of climate change, we can't do that independently. We have to cooperate with China on that, but we have to do it from a position of combined Western economic strength. And we have to do it with an eye to making sure that the standards that we set reflect our shared democratic values.
Is China profiting from the war economically?
So the economic situation in China is not good at the moment, but that has more to do with Corona than with the war,
yes.
with the pandemic, China it's a real tough problem, So the European Union already started before the war to be more skeptical on trade with China. So for example, if Chinese companies want to invest in Germany or in Europe, there's a control, there's a check by the ministries whether that it goes against our security issues. They want to control the European Union that these companies are not subsidized by the Chinese state, because in Europe it's not allowed to have subsidization by the state. So the Beihilfekontrolle, the German word for it. But so Chinese state should also not be allowed to do it, and so there are rules which have been set up. And on the other hand, China is economically much more important than Russia, and 10% of our exports go to China. It's about 2 to 3% to Russia. And companies are saying that, more than half of their profit growth will happen in China because that's a growing country. So it's a very important country. And I guess one of the main lessons is standard setting. I fully agree with that one. And the other one is to get rid of the dependency. So I guess if I were a company, which I'm not active in China, I would really control my supply chain, and say, what happens if the border will be disrupted? What we see it already. What happens if the supply chain is disrupted? But what happens if it will be disrupted for political reason? And that was not on the agenda so far. So German companies were going to China they had worries for other reasons, like can we keep our secrets? And there are many worries with regard to China, but this dependency worry, what happens to the supply chains, that I think is another clear result, and we have to work hard to get rid of the dependency. Otherwise, we have the gas embargo issue. It is a minor issue against, if something in China happens here.
And does the war, as well as the pandemic situation in China, especially with the lockdown, with a really, really hard lockdown, especially in Shanghai, does it show us that our German economic model is no longer working? I mean, what I mean is comparatively cheap energy, cheap raw materials, and now with the rising prices, the calculation, the business models don't work anymore, and we are maybe facing a competitive disadvantage?
So there are some parts of our model won't be working anymore. So energy prices will increase, and they will increase more in Germany than the rest of the world. So oil, there's a world price, so if it's more expensive here, it will be more expensive also somewhere else. Yeah, but because we can't depend so much on the cheap Russian gas, we will have LNG gas, which is more expensive. We will go to the renewable way, so that will also become more expensive. Yeah, if we have more renewables. Yeah. On the other hand, our industry is, I think German products on the world market are not so good because they have cheap energy into it. Yeah, so these are our engineers, our cars, our machines, our pharmaceutical industries. These are very innovative firms. So I'm not too much worried about that part of the business. Yeah, so even if the input prices increase.
Mr. Sharp, is there a difference between US companies and European companies, especially in that term?
With respect to dealing with China, is that your question?
With respect to China?
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. One is that I think that the German economy has benefited from a convergence of tailwinds over the past 10 years or more, past 2 decades. One of those tailwinds was that the American taxpayer was willing to pick up the cost of European security, which enabled German and other European governments to spend money on other priorities. A second tailwind was this cheap flow of Russian oil and gas. And the third was a dependency on the growing Chinese market for business transactions without a maybe long-term regard to the viability of that model, in the sense that eventually the Chinese will stop buying things from us and will want to sell them to us instead, and a disregard for the values question around human rights. So all those tailwinds have kind of ground to a halt, I think, at the same time. I do think that as I go around Germany, I hear a growing awareness within the business community and certainly government leaders about the dangers of doing business to China that I think started in the US earlier. So US businesses, we have lots of US businesses who are like German businesses. Their model is very much fixed on doing trade with China. But I think that in the US, there was an awareness earlier of the dangers of forced technology transfer, theft of intellectual property, the possibility that, or the likelihood that eventually, instead of buying things from the US company, the Chinese would say, thanks very much, but we're now going to sell it to you. And I think that awareness and that the willingness to act on that awareness came later in Germany than in the US. But I think it's very much an issue now. I hear it as I go around. Companies are being much more clear-eyed about the dangers, the potential dangers of doing business with China. And let's not forget that China is dependent on us also. I mean, the main goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to stay in power. And in order to stay in power, they need to provide a continuously rising standard of living for their people, which means that they have to grow that economy. in order to grow that economy, they can't do it internally. They have to do it through trade with the rest of the world. In the past, what they've done is tried to divide the free world and cut deals with individual partners, and to avoid the question of the values, and to use subterfuge and political influence to somehow to make countries willing to continue to do business with them. I think there's a growing awareness in the West that we have to be much more wary of how we do business with China. We have to do business with them. Again, they're part of the world economy, and we're not going to solve climate change or other issues without them, but we just have to be very clear-eyed about how we do that. And I think that the awareness is growing, is much more prevalent now in Germany than it was a year ago. And again, I think the US came to that realization a little bit earlier.
I would like to add a question from the chat. There's an interest in the role of China. And Mr. Wambach, what do you think about the new financial system? Russia and China started working together outside of SWIFT. Wouldn't it be more effective to stop Russia if the US worked more closely with China?
Yeah, so there is this danger that the world is again splitting apart in two halves. Yeah, so the Western world and Russia and China. But, I'm an economist, and from a pure economic point of view, Russia has its resources, but otherwise it's, China is so dependent on the rest of the world. Yeah, we do much more trade with China, yeah, and they need the newest technologies. And, yes, they also need the resources, but, resources, as I said, oil is a world market, so they don't need necessarily Russia for the resources. So I'm actually less worried that we see this Russia-China brick the development in that respect, because they also need the trade with us, and they want to have the new technology. So yes, it could happen if, I don't know, if China escalates and we see developments in China and we see a conflict China-United States, that we get this wall between us much stronger, yeah, but I'm from pure economic point of view, I'm less worried about that aspect.
Looking at the overall economic costs of the war for Germany and the US, Mr. Sharp, we're rising prices at the pump, for example, the inflation that we are now, right now seeing cost President Biden and the Democratic candidates maybe important votes in November's midterm elections?
So, we've seen repeatedly in the US in the past, and also in Germany and other European countries, where often after a big election, a new government comes to power, and expectations and hopes are high, and the hopes are not able to be realized as people thought they would. And in the subsequent midterm elections, or the subsequent elections, that government pays a price. And we saw that with Bill Clinton in 1992. In 1994, the Republicans came to power. So we've seen this, and there's other examples out there too. So I guess that's one way of saying, right now, certainly the Democratic Party is very concerned about the November elections, and history has shown many times in the past that they have reason to be concerned. That said, November is a long way off. 5 months, especially in the shortened political cycles we have now. So I'm going to leave it up to the pundits to figure out what's going to happen in November. But it's a long ways off. I mean, 5 months ago, things in Europe were a lot different. We didn't have a war right here in Ukraine, so a lot can happen in 5 months.
Yeah, a lot can happen, but how dangerous is the situation right now? I mean, with the inflation, and maybe you mentioned it in the beginning of our talk, a possible stagflation.
Yeah, so inflation is a real issue in the United States as it is here, and it's, we haven't seen inflation for a long time. Yeah, so I was talking to bankers and said we don't really know, what to make about it. Yeah, because the models are not well suited for the situation we're in. Yeah, and the central banks, they're trying to really find their way through not, getting inflation down, but also not kind of breaking, having a break for the economy too strongly. Yeah, so it will be a difficult task. ahead of us. And a big part of the inflation, more than half, is rising energy prices. Yeah, the central bank can't do anything about rising energy prices, yeah, but they can do a lot about expectations, how they will get into the market. So they have a hard job in front of us. Yeah, and I guess for Germany or for Europe, we are really, you know, the influence of the war is much stronger in Europe, and there's so much uncertainty. We don't know how long it will last. We don't know how worrisome the pictures will become. We don't know, you know, what the oil embargo or the gas embargo in the end means, yeah, because so far it's, you know, it's theoretical, the oil embargo. Yeah, we have our plans, yeah, but then it has to work through. If I see our models, you know, our models mean economists' models, you know, they are very optimistic that we find ways through those embargoes, yeah, that, you know, companies are very innovative in finding new supply chains, you know, and getting their product with different means, yeah. But, you know, there's a lot, in those models, there's a lot of optimism, yeah. So, but, you know, maybe one should have some optimism, yeah. But because there's so much uncertainty, we don't, you know, there is also, with regard to inflation, investment, and so on, there's really a break to the development. Yeah.
At that moment, I would like to thank you for the lively contribution in the chat. The audience is participating, and this is very nice to see that. We're trying to take up as many questions as possible in the last 10 minutes that we have left. And one point that comes up, Mr. Sharp, many European commentators say that the economic costs of the war are asymmetrically distributed across the Atlantic. That has to do with the rising cost of energy, the migrants that are coming more to Europe, of course, than to the US, distortions in exports and imports, among others. Do you agree? Do you agree that this is asymmetrically distributed?
I think that the US, I think that the US has repeatedly shown that we are here to unite with the Europeans on defending the West. We have a huge number of military troops here that we have deployed to Europe in response to Mr. Putin's war to help bolster Europe, to bolster NATO's eastern flank. We are the largest donor of assistance to Ukraine in terms of military and security assistance, economic assistance, and humanitarian assistance. On the question of migrants, I would point out that this is a lot different from previous crises we've seen, where I know as I go out and talk to communities and organizations that are helping Ukrainian refugees, most of these Ukrainian refugees want to go back to Ukraine. They want to go back to their country and help rebuild it. And so they're not looking for the long-term residency in Germany or elsewhere, or certainly the United States, that previous waves of refugees we've seen, because they want to go back and rebuild their country, because they really do, they believe strongly in the ability to rebuild Ukraine. So that's different also. And so I think that to try to assess that, you know, somebody's not paying their fair share or something like that, or the costs are asymmetrically imposed, is not really a fair, holistic look at where we are. I think I feel proud of the US's role in helping to unify the West in this response to Mr. Putin's aggression, the way that we've worked really closely with our European and other Western democratic allies to make sure that we are unified in response. When we saw our Secretary of Defense was in Ramstein Air Base a couple of weeks ago to with ministers of defense and chiefs of defense from 40 different countries. So not just NATO countries, but well beyond, countries representing more than 50% of the world's economy, to come up with ways that we could do this in a unified way together. So I would prefer to focus on the unity, the unprecedented unity, I would say, that we're seeing, rather than attempts to sort of find ways to divide us by nickel and diming over who's contributing more, who's contributing less.
And another question also from the chat is, in this context, how do you see the role of the US versus the EU in a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia? What are the red lines the US is not willing to cross in a possible compromise between the two countries?
We're going to take our lead from Ukraine on this. It's their country that's been attacked, and it's their country that's at stake here. Our goal, I would say, is that we want to see emerge from this. We want to make sure that there is a democratic, free, independent, and sovereign Ukraine. So it's not for us, this is not our war in the sense that we're not directly involved in conflict with Russia. So we're going to support President Zelensky and the decisions that he makes about what kind of end state or peace agreement that his country, that is acceptable to his country.
Mr. Wombach, maybe you can also see it from a positive side. If we make the right conclusions right now, could the whole situation also be a stimulus for the economy on the long run? Because there's so much pressure now to change so many things.
Yeah, it's hard to be on the positive side, yeah. So I guess we get this boost for the renewable energies, yeah, so that you can count on the positive side. We have, in Europe, we see much more union in Europe, yeah, so that is on the positive side, and we also need stronger developments in Europe, inside Europe, yeah. I'm also, I think NATO, when did Macron say that NATO is brain dead? Yeah, so some years ago, yeah. So
maybe, I don't know.
That's right. And now we see NATO really, the importance of the NATO, and that also means that our Western alliance is becoming so important. And that's also, I think, it's a positive effect, because in recent years we have seen a lot of criticism across these, both inside Europe but also across our Western alliance. And so that I would count as the positive effects of this war.
And maybe will the EU emerge stronger from the conflict?
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell. Yeah, at the beginning I would say yes, but if the conflict prolongs, yeah, and we see Hungary is already at the moment critical, we see voters in other countries are becoming critical. Yeah, so I think they are doing the best. Yeah, that we stay united, and I think it's also a clear message out of this war, yeah, that Europe has, concentrate on those issues where it really gives a value added, where it's better to be inside Europe than to be a single country, and that's one of the lesson out of this war, and I hope that will stay with the people. Yeah.
How do you see that, Mr. Sharp? Could be a stronger EU and be an outcome of the war, and what would it mean for the US and the relationship?
So I like the way that you said you started by saying you weren't sure whether you could find some positive things, and you listed off a whole bunch of positive things that we're seeing here, and I totally agree with you on all those positive things, and I think that really this has underlined the importance of this unity around the question of democratic values, and it also emphasizes this point we were talking about before, that together. And whether it's the US and Europe together, Europe as a whole working together, we can do much more than if we tried to do it individually. And our hope in the United States is that this is something that we'll continue to be able to build on in the future. China, Russia, other authoritarian states would love nothing more than if the West goes to bickering among itself and we all play as individual smaller players. But we're going to do much better on these long-term challenges, on these challenges to our rules-based order, if we act together. To do that, we need German leadership. We need strong German leadership in Germany. We need strong German leadership in Europe, and we need strong German leadership on the world stage. So that's one of the things that we're seeing from this. We were talking about the financial the question of the stagflation issue. Next week, Germany, in its role as president of the G7, is going to have a finance ministerial here in Germany. And that, I'm sure, will be one of the top questions on the agenda. At the end of June, the heads of state of all the G7 countries will meet in Bavaria. And I think that we're going to see out of this is more and more Western unity, which is not what China wants, which is not what Russia wants. And they're going to try to find ways to peel individual countries off, to cut side deals, and to divide us and prevent us from acting in a united way. But I think that everybody is now seeing out of this conflict the importance of acting together.
Mr. Sharp, Mr. Wombach, time is flying. We're almost done. The hour is almost over. But I would like to have two last questions to you, sort of a closing round. Mr. Scharp, you have been, I would say, more optimistic. What would be your optimistic outlook?
What would be my optimistic outlook?
Optimistic.
So my optimistic outlook would be that that as I said, Ukraine emerges from this as a free, democratic, independent country. That the West builds on this incredible unity that we've seen over the last couple of months that has come out of what Russia's done, and that we go back to this question of focus on values with an eye to the challenge of the future, China. And we unite ourselves in a way through setting standards and through working together on problems. We unite ourselves in a way that enables us to fully utilize the economic power that we have, and to again unite around these values that we have. And I think the other thing is I'm optimistic that this move from fossil fuels to a greener future based on renewables, based on hydrogen, is going to be accelerated because of what we've seen, this weaponization of energy, of fossil fuels.
Mr. Bomhoff, yeah, Mr. Bomhoff, would you agree on that? And also, what two main lessons do you draw as an economist at the consequences of the war?
First, I fully agree. So that's the optimistic view, and I would be happy to see it going in that direction. And also happy to see that in the United States, we keep on this opinion that it's better to work together. Yeah, that was not always the time. Yeah, the case. Yeah. So, no, that's one point from economics point of view. One thing is that we liked to have the situation where economics is economics and diplomacy was something else, yeah. So and foreign politics was something else, yeah. We can't sustain that ideal model anymore, yeah, because economics is very deeply inclined and intertwined with foreign policy, security issues, and so on. And we have to think that anew. Yeah. So far we thought, for example, diversification. It's up to the business to diversify their supply chain. What we now realize is it's also up to the government to help business to supply to diversify the supply chain. And I think that's a lot of, we don't have the economic models for these situations yet, so that's a lot more needs to be done. And I think the other economic lesson is that I think, so far trade agreements was a little bit like talking about tariffs up and downs, and with the United States we talked about Chlorhühnchen, the chicken, whether, the chicken in the United States is, we should stop with these debates. Yeah, we should concentrate on the relevant things in these debates. And one consequence out of this war is, I think, that we learn the hard way, what are the relevant issues, and these are security issues as well. These are, dependency management, and that we concentrate on these parts.
So there's a lot of work for economists right now to be done to develop the models for this case that we haven't experienced before. I thank you very much for the lively discussion, U.S. Consul General Norman Thatcher Sharp from Frankfurt and the president of the ZEW, Achim Wambach. And thank you for following us and listening. There will be a follow-up report coming soon on ZEW website. And also, if you have missed the beginning or part of it, there will be soon this whole discussion on the YouTube channel of ZEW. The next event will take place on the 1st of June. Namely, a panel discussion organized together with the Ministry of Science, Research and Arts of Baden-Württemberg in Stuttgart on the topic Digital Health, Why Germany Needs More Health Data. Quite a little bit different from today. I thank you very much for joining us, and we would be pleased if you join us then again. I say goodbye for today. My name is Jessica Stormberg, and I wish you a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.